Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for another NetHope Solutions Center webinar. Today we're starting a three-part series on AI ethics. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping guidelines for today's session. We'd like to keep the session interactive. Please open your Zoom chat window and place any comments or questions there for our Q&A discussion at the end of our session. Later on today, you'll receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording and the collateral for this session. It's linked to the NetHope Solutions Center. And we'd love it if you could provide us with feedback on this session. A webinar satisfaction poll will pop up at the end of today's session, and we'd love it if you could fill that out. We appreciate your feedback so that we can make these sessions better and better every time. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Layla Toplick, lead for Emerging Technologies Initiative with NetHope.
Thank you, Madeline. Good morning to everyone from Seattle. I hope everyone is safe and healthy. And on behalf of the NetHope AI Working Group and our collaborators, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the AI Ethics webinar series. Next slide, Madeline, please. Now, before I share with you what we have planned for this first part of the AI Ethics webinar series, I want to briefly say a few words around why we're focusing on AI and ethics. And what I know from the work of the NetHope's 57 global NGO members and also others in the sector that are present here today is that there's a whole set of problems across humanitarian development and conservancy space that AI, along with the other tools, can help us solve. AI systems with their capacity to learn, to predict, and in some instances to make decisions based on those predictions and take specific actions can help us do a number of things better, reach more people with services and information they need, like maybe education, legal or health information, which is what we're seeing right now in the time of COVID. They can help us make decisions and act faster in emergencies. As well as predict problems before they spread and escalate, like infectious diseases or famines, and prevent loss of life, whether it's wildlife or human life, and loss of resources. But the challenge that is facing nonprofit organizations and their partners today is to responsibly develop and use AI technology, maximizing its benefits while minimizing risks and also protecting human rights. So with AI being relatively new in the nonprofit sector, now is really an important time and good time to proactively build capacity to both explore beneficial use of AI, which is what we've done over the past 18 months, as well as to assess risks and address unintentional consequences. Next slide, Madeline, please. And this is also why NetHope's AI Working Group, that's a group of global NGOs, has partnered with USAID and MIT D-Lab to deliver a set of webinars, also virtual workshops, to equip the nonprofit sector with the information that we all need in order to design and use AI responsibly and ethically. So on this slide, you see the core group of collaborators that have been working together for a few months now to design and curate content and discussions we'll make available to all of you over the next few months, starting with this first webinar, and also invite you to contribute and help shape what topics we cover in the future. Now, before I share with you what we have planned for May and June, I'd like to invite my colleagues from USAID, from Plan International, and MIT D-Lab to say a few words about their involvement in this collaboration that is focused on AI ethics for nonprofits. First, I'll hand it over to Amy Paul from USAID.
Great. Hello, everybody. My name is Amy Paul. As Layla mentioned, I'm a technical advisor on the strategy and research team at USAID Center for Digital Development. And on behalf of our whole team, I'd really just like to say how excited we are to be part of this collaboration. This is a topic that we care a lot about and are excited to have the opportunity to share with this audience. It's really a fantastic chance to bring together the great work that we've been doing with NetHope on the development of the toolkit and through MIT's D-Lab on fairness and machine learning, So you'll hear more from me next time, but for the moment, just really glad to be here and included in the collaboration.
Thanks so much, Amy, and thank you to USAID for support. Nora Lindstrom from Plan International, one of NetHope members. Nora, would love to hear from you next.
Thanks, Leila. I'm Nora Lindstrom, the Global Lead for Digital Development at Plan. And this is just such a hugely important topic. Leila mentioned, the potential benefits of AI, but at the same time in international development, we work with often very vulnerable and often marginalized communities. And I just don't believe that we have the right to introduce AI that could potentially cause further harm to these groups. I think it's so hugely important that when we're looking at developing AI and using AI, we use AI that is humane and ethical. So that it's hugely important that we're doing this work now. Also, I think that collaborating on this topic to really bring sort of a diversity of expertise and points of view is essential. And so I think it's fantastic that we've been able to do this with USAID and the MIT Lab, but also more broadly in the NetHope AI working group. So I'm really happy that you've taken the lead on this, Leila. Thank you.
Thank you, Nora, and thank you for leading this work on behalf of the NetHope AI Working Group. And now our collaborators from MIT Lab, Kendra Leith and Amit Gandhi. Kendra, over to you first.
Great, thanks so much, Leila. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. We're really excited to participate in this series. This is a really important topic for us as well, recognizing there are potential benefits of engaging in AI and machine learning, but also challenges and risks as well. And so we need to think about those things in a thoughtful way, in an ethical way. So this is a really important topic for us. And we have most recently been thinking about these issues through a collaborative project with USAID, with Amy's team, actually. I've been helping to manage a project on exploring fairness in machine learning. We've been putting together a guide for considerations, fairness considerations when working in machine learning projects, as well as a series of videos and a workshop. So we are excited to discuss some of these ideas in the third session, and look forward to talking about this further with our colleagues from NetHope, from Plan, and from USAID. So thanks so much for including us.
Thank you. Amit, just a brief introduction. Everybody will have the opportunity to hear from you on June 18th.
Great. Yeah, I'm Amit Gandhi. I'm an instructor at MIT Lab and a graduate researcher. As Kendra mentioned, we're really excited about working in this space. And on our third webinar on June 18th, I'll be talking more about some of the work we've done with USAID, with NetHope, Plan International, to figure out how we can address some of these issues of fairness and ethics.
Thank you. Thank you all. This is also an opportunity to invite everyone on this call to provide ideas and to help us shape the future set of webinars and workshops that we'll be hosting over the next few months. So if we click to the next slide, I want to share with you the webinars that we have planned specifically for May and June. So this three-part series, and we'll be adding more webinars in the future. This is just to get the conversation started. And this set of topics has been curated with the input from NetHope members. So today, we'll start with a brief introduction to ethics, AI ethics, and responsible innovation. And then we thought it would be important to really ground some of these kind of key concepts in the context of a real practical implementation. So we'll take a look at the potential risks and ethical considerations in the context of an example from the international development sector. Then next, on June 4th, we'll examine what AI and machine learning are good for, meaning the use cases and also the risks. And we'll do that through the lens of values. And we'll discuss questions like, what are some of the values that should guide responsible use of AI in practice? What risks might be encountered with respect to implementing machine learning and AI tools in accordance with those values, and how do we mitigate them? So Amy will talk more about that on June 4th. And then on June 18th, we'll welcome back Amy and then Amit to help us get even more practical with a step-by-step process that explores ethical considerations and specifically fairness in that webinar across all stages of a machine learning project, from problem definition and data collection to model creation, implementation, and maintenance. And we'll cover some of the also practical things you can do, like questions you can ask to mitigate the risks. So in summary, these first 3 webinars are really designed to help nonprofits build a foundational understanding of AI ethics in the nonprofit sector. And we strongly recommend to watch all 3 webinars, and if possible, in the same order we have them scheduled. The content is sequenced to build on the knowledge of the preceding webinar. Now, I want to take a moment to quickly learn about who we have joining us today, specifically how familiar you are with ethics and AI ethics. So Madeline, if I can ask you to launch the poll, and if you can just let us know if how familiar you are with AI ethics quickly. And thank you for taking the time to do that. We'll give it probably another 5 seconds, Madeline. Okay. Great. We have such a diverse group here. Thank you so much for taking the time to share that with us. So if we go to the next slide, it's really representative of what we've actually seen among the NetHope community, a diverse group with regards to the knowledge of ethics and AI ethics. So hopefully everyone will get something new from this webinar and subsequent webinars. Next slide, please. So in this specific session, we'll provide an introduction to ethics, specifically in AI ethics. One thing that I want to note is that this introduction to ethics is by no means meant to be exhaustive. In fact, what I want to do in next 15 minutes or so is provide you an overview of key concepts that will give you enough baseline for us to begin discussing how nonprofits and their partners can balance the beneficial use of AI that I talked about earlier with the potential harms. Also, we'll provide a set of resources for those of you who are interested in learning more about ethics in more detail. So next slide, let's begin by defining ethics. And for the purposes of this conversation, I'll use the definition from the European Commission and define ethics as a set of values and principles that guide the way in which we behave as individuals and as a group. So let me just double click on what we mean by values and principles. Values are broad beliefs that are held by individuals or groups that reflect concepts of social and cultural importance and norms of appropriate behavior. So ethical values define our moral conduct and help us determine what is right or what is wrong. And an example of a value is integrity, and another example of value is respect. Now, principles, on the other hand, guide responsible innovation by providing direction for how to embed values in design and use of solutions. Example principles might be fairness or do no harm. So then third component I want to talk about, because it is important for the work we'll be doing here together, are this kind of set of guidelines and frameworks. They're meant to provide practical tools to operationalize values and principles. So values and principles are important because they help us protect and promote the well-being of the individuals and communities that the solutions and programs we're creating will affect. And one thing that's important to keep in mind is that just because you have values and principles, it's not always obvious how to apply them in real life situations. So sometimes values can be embedded in the systems in subtle ways that you don't even realize right away. Other times you might find that actions that are consistent with one value might conflict with another one. For example, you might have a situation where you need to balance the need for privacy, like not asking for any personal data, and fairness that might require you to understand better who your solution is serving or not. So in this instance, by prioritizing privacy, you might introduce bias. So as designers, we'll often need to engage in value trade-off and decide what is most important in a given context. Next slide, please. Now, the focus in this webinar series is AI ethics, which is a field of ethics that has emerged both as the pace of innovation in this space accelerated, but also somewhat in response to a whole set of issues that AI systems might cause. And we'll talk about some of those issues later in the webinar. And for the purposes of this discussion, we'll use the definition of AI ethics from the Alan Turing Institute, which defines AI ethics as a set of values, principles, and techniques that employ widely accepted standards of right and wrong to guide moral conduct in the development and use of AI technologies. What this means is when we teach a machine to learn, we're embedding values from the surrounding social context and sometimes personal values in these choices we make about both design and use of the system. And we can use ethical principles to help guide those decisions and develop AI systems that act in a manner considered morally acceptable by us. Next slide, please. So what is an ethical humane technology solution, or in this case, an ethical AI solution? It is a solution that supports individual and collective well-being and enhances our ability to tackle global challenges. And the reason why it's important to design and use technology in an ethical way is because technology today has power to not only extend our capacity, as we know, like as we're able to connect here today, but also to shape how we live and our actions. So when we hear statements like, if something goes wrong, blame technology, or we can't stop technological progress, or technology is value neutral, it is important to pause and remember that technology cannot be value neutral because it manifests the values of its designers and or surrounding. Also, we get to decide what problems we want to solve, and whether to use certain technological capabilities that might cause harm. So in fact, we ought to take responsibility for the technologies we create and use. Next slide. So the way we get to an ethical technology solution is through the process of responsible innovation, which is meant to be a transparent, interactive, sustainable process by which organizations proactively evaluate how they can design and use technology in ways that are aligned with their values and missions. And by interactive, I mean a couple of things. First, inclusive, and we'll talk a bit about that later today. Reflecting basic values of the people that the innovation is affecting. Responsive to their needs and feedback they're providing, and anticipatory of what can go wrong. So in practice, responsible innovation involves a number of things, like you might need to decide what problems to focus on solving. Is it global hunger, climate change, or something else? We also need to decide what values to embed in the solution and think through what a solution might enable, as well as what might no longer be possible due to this solution, and ask who this solution might empower or disempower. So when designing new innovations, we're effectively shaping the options and choices for its users. Now, one thing that I want to note is specific to the technology we'll be talking about in this webinar series, AI. It's important to keep in mind that this is a data-driven technology. AI systems require massive amounts of data. So when we talk about ethical technology solution in the context of AI, we'll need to give proper attention to data, because data can be used to both inform and create valuable solutions that people want and need, but it can also be used in an exploitative and discriminatory way. Next slide, please. So we've talked about values and principles. I want to briefly touch on frameworks and guidelines that I mentioned when I defined ethics earlier. These can be practical tools to operationalize values and principles. And recent years have seen an increasing interest in technology ethics, driven to an extent by also some of the high-profile scandals like Cambridge Analytica. And this growing interest in technology ethics has in fact led to almost a proliferation of ethical guidelines and ethics frameworks by a significant number of institutions and companies intended to guide the responsible development and use of technology. So this timeline from the Humanitarian Data Science and Ethics Group shows how AI ethics emerged fairly recently in 2016 and gained more traction and importance in the last 2 years. Next slide, please. And we have another data visualization. This one is from the Principles Artificial Intelligence Project by the Berkman Klein Cyber Law Clinic at Harvard University. This shows 36 prominent AI principles documents that have been created just in the last couple of years. And what I want to highlight about these frameworks is 4 things for us to keep in mind. First, they could be useful mechanisms to highlight important issues and moral values. They can help guide the design and use of technologies in a way that is ethically, socially, also environmentally responsible. But second, they're not regulations or mandatory. And there is a growing concern that these frameworks are potentially just nice words and they are not supported by action, including implementation of these principles, monitoring and enforcement. Some call this ethics washing. So it is important not only to have ethical principles, guidelines, and frameworks, but to also operationalize them across the whole organization, like the teams we hire, what problems we choose to solve, how we design and implement the solutions, and more. And third, it's important to note and pay attention to who wrote the principles and the frameworks, and that matters because the motivation and use cases could be different. And lastly, while there's been a number of these guidelines and frameworks that have been created, not much of that is actually focused on the sector that we're focused on, which is the humanitarian and international development sector. And this is somewhat understandable because the pace of change and the innovation in AI space, new tools, new use cases, is sort of outpacing our ability in the sector to design and implement practical ethical guidance for the sector. And this is something we are looking to address in the coming months through this webinar series, a set of virtual workshops, and an AI ethics toolkit. Now, we talked about some of the benefits of AI as well as values, principles, responsible innovation. I want to talk about some of the issues next. Next slide, please. In order to guide the design and use of technology toward optimal public benefit that we talked about earlier, we have to be aware of the risks and issues. And here are a few of the most recent and recurrent ethical issues in this space. And we kind of group them into kind of 3 categories. Intentional harms, that might include hate speech, misinformation, weaponization of technologies like AI, infringement on rights and values, such as surveillance. This might infringe on our rights to privacy, freedom of movement, freedom of assembly. Also unfair outcomes like discrimination and prejudice that are stemming from bias that might be embedded in AI systems. Next slide, please. Now, bias is one of the potential harms that can be caused by AI systems, and it will be the focus of the first set of webinars. And here's why. As outlined by the Alan Turing Institute, AI systems can cause harm by reproducing, reinforcing, and amplifying the patterns of marginalization, inequality, and discrimination. They can replicate their designers' preconceptions and biases, and use data that is insufficiently representative of the populations from which they're drawing inferences. And this is actually happening today with the automated technologies that are being used for predictive policing, for criminal sentencing, or to determine who gets welfare benefits and how much, and who is considered at risk of child abuse. So what we've seen from some of these examples is that AI systems can learn to reproduce, to maintain, and also to scale existing societal discrimination and propagate social inequalities. So on that note, now would be a good time to take a look at an example of practical implementation of AI in the international development sector that highlights some of these issues we just talked about. Next slide, please. Now I'm excited to be joined by Haya Umaran and Nora Lindstrom from one of our NetHope member organizations, Plan International. Haya is joining us from the Philippines today. It's already 11 o'clock at night there, and she will take us through TESSA example and talk about some of the issues and how Plan International has addressed those issues. And Nora Lindstrom, who you heard from earlier, is joining us from Finland, and Nora will talk about gender bias and the path to achieving ethical AI. Over to you, Haya.
Hi everyone. Thank you, Leila. Yeah, I'm Haya from Plan International, the TESA product owner. So for today, I'm gonna share with you some of our experience and what are the techniques that we have applied to mitigate and avoid occurrences of these unintentional harms that Laila just mentioned, that can be introduced by this AI system. So in your screen, you can see that we have TESA. TESA stands for an acronym for Training Employment Support Services Assistant. Basically, um, this is in alignment in our commitment to Plan International's vision to transform the lives of 100 billion girls. And for us, for our team, we are committed to provide support to vulnerable young people. Next slide, please. Right. So what we are trying to provide through the use of the digital technology is how can we help to support young people, especially within Asia, to help them effectively express and communicate their skills through connection, and then later on to connect them with potential job and training opportunities. And to help lessen the barriers that our young people are experiencing. Next slide, please. Right. And then basically the key features of TESA can be accessed through your Facebook Messenger. And what it uses is the AI natural processing language. So we're trying to engage with youth through our natural conversation, and then helping them out to articulate their skills, their talents, and their employability, by capturing the information and then creating them CVs. Also, TESA provides mentorship and coaching so that during the interviews, they can also be prepared prior to the employment. And also, as mentioned, we are trying to connect as well them so that they connect to possible job and opportunities. All right. Next slide, please. All right. So, of course, the prototype version of TESA was developed within 6 months in partnership with Accenture. And then later on, another 12 months to incorporate the user feedback to the design. And it wasn't a smooth sailing journey for us. There were also some challenges and concerns raised while we are designing and implementing it, the prototype version. And to share with you, basically related to the AI biases, we have these are the challenges in terms of the team, data, problem framing, model tools, and implementation. And I'm gonna quickly discuss each item to give inside an example. Uh, Click, please. All right. So for the team, the TESA project team is comprised of 9 members. Out of the 9 members, we have 4 people on the age group of below 29, and also we have 4 women on the team. Also, from our team members, we have some resources or people, developers who grew on the rural areas. Why is it important? This is because we would like to have a balanced perspective, especially in terms of algorithm. Leila mentioned that on how we build technology is manifested by the values of the designer. And unconsciously, whatever it is that they build in the algorithm can be also embedded on how they program it or how it is developed. So it's very important that we put also consideration that who are the people that we put or to contribute on the development team. Now, in terms of data, yes, there are pros and cons for this one. And we have to be mindful what are our intentions. So maybe for commercial products, it's like whenever you have a product that you like to use, or maybe you're shopping online, the frequent, the more that you click on that interest of yours, then later on, machine learning will create a recognized pattern and provide you that uh, set of interesting things or topics. But that is not the case for us, because for, let's say for example, if our target is to employ young women, but however, if the young women that we are trying to help are not yet empowered, imagine that they will always tend to select female dominated jobs like beauticians, for example. Then if we're gonna use that data, then we are not actually addressing the problem. We are just reinforcing that. So that means as a designer, a systems analyst or BA, product owner, we should be mindful of that. That do we really need to use that logic or that pattern? Or are we just reinforcing again marginalization? Next will be the problem framing. So this is more so of being designing of the intentional inclusion. So to cite an example, while we are on the initial stage of developing TESA, we have overlooked of accommodating or inclusivity for person with disability. But later on, we realized that, wait, how can we provide recommended jobs to person with disability if we don't even know who are there? So on the design itself, and even on the activity, we conducted a human-centered design activity, which is inclusive for person with disabilities. And it turned out actually our assumptions were incorrect. Like, for example, we thought that it's only the job opportunities that are lacking, that we are not offering to person with disability. However, during that HCD activity, the three major issues that they have shared with us is about bullying in the workplace. Yes, they do have a job, but later on they will leave their jobs because of the bullying. Another item is the capacity training, that they feel that they should be provided with opportunities on capacity building and also training. The third item is about cross-training. There are persons with disabilities probably already working for 10 years doing that same job. But because there are changing demand on the jobs, once they are laid off, even they are very skilled on their previous job, they need to adjust and learn new skills. And that is their problem because it's not always provided to them um, or offered to their sector. In modeling and tools, of course, it's not always out of the box that you can design something. Sometimes you also need to improvise within your organization some kind of metrics and scaling. So for Plan International, TESA have undergo a gender marker or transformative assessment. And then we also conducted ICT assessment for those interesting countries, especially for AI application, because we all know that one of the requirements will be internet connectivity. And you might need to consider if the country or the organization is ready to adapt to AI. In terms of implementation, it's of course good to have an agile approach. So for our development team, we're observing agile, but as you also know that Scrum is easy to understand, for example, but very difficult to master. Why? Because it's not only the development team that needs to know about being agile, it's the whole organization. So you have to make sure that either you conduct workshop or seminars with the management and stakeholders so that all of you can move and progress as a group and collaboratively. Also, it's about handling documentations. Laila mentioned about sustainability. It's also important that in your strategy and planning, you already incorporated that handover to make sure that the country can also sustain and maintain the cost, especially the ICT resources that they need after the product development has been completed. Next slide, please. All right. So as we discuss about the biases and data, so in here you will see this is the initial persona of TESA. On how we asked the youth at this stage, we asked them, who do you like to have interesting conversation? Because we are, our mindset was we're gonna use a chatbot, so it has something to do with the conversation. So this is how it turned out, like a secretary persona. Now, changing the question now to who do you reach out to if you want to find a job or help you find a job? So now this persona is significantly changed to a different persona that we have right now. So it's like to the Philippines, because we piloted the TESA in the Philippines, it's like an elder sister, ages from 30 and above. So that's what we mean also, that at the beginning, this is how we have perceived it, but later on, we have to revisit how did we ask the question anyway at that time. Next will be expressing the conversation and job recommendations. So in here, we have to also make sure, because TESA is connecting youth to job opportunities, we also have to make sure that we are not using gender marked titles. For example, for job recommended jobs, like for example, midwife, mailman. So if the government agency that we're partnering where we create job does not observe that, then that's where the advocacy efforts of Plan International comes in, that we have to help them to embed in their policies to be more gender transformative. And then, yeah, and also making sure again that the job recommendation will be not biased. So if we, like for example, in some cases, some women often search for a job again for female dominated jobs. So again, we cannot use that kind of algorithm that we always feed them that kind of job, because it will not help them to explore opportunities and to empower them that there are things and opportunities for them that can be offered in the other male dominated jobs. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is just on how we scale TESA, as mentioned, the gender marker. As you can see, it's not really like a perfect score. 3 is the highest and 1 is the lowest. But it also gives us more areas of improvement, like how can we further design TESA to make it more inclusive and have be more gender uh, race gender equality. So gender norms is just pertain on how we lessen the discrimination. So for TESA, we're trying to help the girls to make a decision on their own and then to give them some options to choose. Working with boys and men, yeah, we still need to work on this out, but to cite an example, our development team, prior to designing and the development on the phase 2, have undergone Gender Awareness 101. And the outcome was our technical lead actually is the one who's a guy, who's a male, insists that he needs a woman developer to be onboarded. So we waited for that. So it's just saying an expression that, we really need to empower young boys and men to understand and to engage with us in terms of gender equality. Then another item that maybe I can emphasize is the enabling environment. This is where the Plan International advocacy and influencing part comes in again to influence the policies of government agencies, CSOs, on their strategies and planning. Next slide, please. Then in here, just emphasizing that not only on the design, but also in the roadmap, to intentionally include the gender inclusion requirements. So on December, prior again to the design, we have that Gender Awareness 101 activity. And then on the second part of that, we have incorporated the person with disability capturing the information. And then with this month until August, we're trying to incorporate the the logic of providing the right and fit jobs for persons with disabilities. Next slide, please. Okay. So for our team, at least for the TESA project team, we do realize and believe that we have to intentionally exclude in our product design and activity. Otherwise, we will unintentionally exclude them. So I'll hand it over to Nora, my colleague, who will give more information on the gender equality and technologies. Thank you.
Thanks, Haya. So as Haya has shown, biases that the team developing an AI holds, as well as biases contained within the data that is used, as well as produced by the system, can, unless mitigated, result in us creating AI systems that exclude, discriminate, and entrench existing inequalities, resulting in headlines like these. If we can get the next slide, please. Now, that this would be the case when it comes to reproducing harmful gender biases is hardly surprising, given that, as recent UNDP research has shown, next slide please, biases against women are really widespread and entrenched globally. Next slide please. And there's also the issue of the lack of gender data. So not only does the data that we have produce and contain biases, but also we don't have much of the data that we need to develop AI systems that don't reproduce gender biases. Next slide, please. And we, of course, also have the well-known issue of lack of diversity in tech and in AI specifically. And of course, while being female isn't a guarantee in any way against being biased against women, we do know that more diverse teams are more likely to help check balances, as was the case in TESA as well. But something that we've been thinking about is whether a biased AI system is, by definition, unethical. So Layla defined ethical humane technology as technology that supports individual and collective well-being and enhances our ability to tackle global challenges. So you could argue that ethical humane AI would have to be biased, but biased in favor of collective well-being. Next slide, please. So at Plan, we've been working on a concept called equality tech. Essentially, it's technology that by design advances gender equality. And AI is, of course, in a great position to do this. We already know it can do the opposite. So why couldn't it be an ally to advance gender equality for us? Now, here's a practical example of what that could look like. If we go to the next slide, please. Now, the Finnish pronoun hän is gender neutral. And for the longest time, this is how Google Translate would add gender bias to Finnish to English translations. A president was always a he, a coder a he, a nanny a she. Now, last week, when I went to check, next slide, please, Google Translate gave me this. And I was super excited because while I wasn't able to establish exactly how many millions, hundreds of millions of users Google Translate has, it is in the hundreds of millions. And by doing this, by giving both she is the president and he is the president, Google Translate can in a really simple way be an equality ally and help us break down harmful gender norms in society and advance equality. Because as we learned in developing TESA, being intentionally inclusive, it really matters in in our use of AI and how it can help us as a society to actually do better and become better, to nudge us forward. Now, to summarize, here are some key questions. Next slide, please. So some key questions that our experience with AI shows that you need to ask in order to avoid developing AI systems that entrench harmful gender biases. And many of these are also featured in the AI suitability framework for nonprofits that NetHope has already developed. But really looking at, is your team diverse? Do you have the right data? Do you have enough data? Does the data you need actually exist? Are there biases in the data that you have? How could AI amplify potential biases? And what are the potential negative outcomes or harmful use cases that could result from the solution you're creating? But very importantly, I think as well, and this is where our concept of equality tech comes in, is does your AI maintain the status quo, knowing that the status quo is one of gender inequality and many other inequalities, I might add? Or does your AI system or solution actually advance equality and act as an ally for us? I'll stop there. Over to you, Leila.
Thank you so much, Nora, and thank you, Haya. It is always helpful to ground our understanding of these concepts of values and principles and harms in the context of a real practical example. So I really appreciate you sharing the example from Plan and also elevating the topic of gender bias as something that we all need to really pay attention to. What you'll see here is a set of resources, and there's so many resources, as mentioned earlier, on the topic of AI ethics. These are some of the resources that we wanted to highlight for you, and we'll also encourage you in the survey to share with us what other resources would be helpful to add to the library we'll be curating over the next few months. So with that, we'll actually go to the Q&A. And before we do the Q&A, we'd actually like to hear from you based on this first webinar and what you heard me say about what's coming next in the next two webinars. What are some of the topics that you would like to see covered in future AI ethics webinars and workshops? And we've provided a couple of examples here just based on what we've heard from NetHope members and partners. If you have other topics, do put them in the chat window. What you share here will help us actually shape the webinar series to really meet your needs. We'll give you a few seconds to respond to this poll, and in the meantime, I'll take a look at the questions. All right. Madeline, shall we see that? Okay, fantastic. Thank you. This is actually consistent with what we've heard from the NetHope AI Working Group. There is a real desire for having practical tools for AI ethics, but also interesting to see that you'd like to see more of the examples from the nonprofit sector of what can go wrong and how to address the issue. So something similar to what Plan has just shared. We are actually planning also a set of virtual workshops where we'll focus on a set of use cases from the sectors. But if you have examples that you'd like to share with us in our community, do reach out to me. You see my email on the screen, and then also hearing from the tech companies and knowing how to design a responsible organization. So with that, let's take a few questions and we'll get to as many as possible. So first question is actually for Haya. Haya, well, thank you so much for your presentation. As this listener noted, Emily is interested to know what role you believe data analysts play in recognizing biased patterns in the data, or how automated AI and ML systems can be identifying these problems for themselves.
All right, thank you, Leila, for that question. I think data analysts should be able to identify the red flags right away and understanding the purpose, why are actually they're doing the product itself or designing it. But I think also that data analysts or even other IT positions should undergo gender awareness and inclusion if possible, so that keeping in mind these principles and values, they are already, conscious that whenever they develop or they review data, it's already there. So yeah, and in terms of machine learning, how do we recognize? Um, just recently, I've read an article that I think this is just 2 days ago that Microsoft have just created an AI bias checking tool, and the principles were aligned to the Turing model. So what they did is they created a source code actually to count, to validate and verify that are your codes introducing biases. So I think you can explore more on that on those kind of tools. But if by manual procedure, I think again the manifestation will go back again to the values of the designer. So I hope I was able to answer that.
Great, thanks, thanks, Haya. And the tool that Haya just referenced is the Fair Learn Toolkit by Microsoft that was announced last November, and just this week at MS Build, it was announced that it will be available in June to let organizations that are developing machine learning models in Azure test for biases in their systems. So take a look at that. Next question, I'll ask you, Nora, if you can comment on this. Once an organization becomes aware of the bias of AI, what is the likelihood they will correct this? If you can speak from the perspective of plan and what you've seen.
I mean, I think it's very hard to establish the likelihood there, but what I have seen through my engagement with the NetHope AI working group, as well as within plan, that there's a lot of the awareness of issues with bias in AI and other sort of concerns with AI, and people are really wanting to engage. We're seeing a lot of new members regularly coming into the working group, which I think is really a sign that this is something that many organizations in our sector are wanting to address. I think at the same time, there's also this tension or concern that if we focus too much on the ethics and the potential harms and biases, then we won't be able to do anything with AI, and there's going to be a complete sort of stop to it. And so I think that, like, looking at the issues through these practical examples and really looking at how can you mitigate some of the potential biases through diverse teams and so on is helpful in help. And we're also working on this, setting up some kind of framework to give these sort of practical ideas of what you can do to mitigate the potential harms, so that our organizations aren't just going to be like, absolutely don't do any AI, but actually enable us to explore AI and then have a framework for mitigating biases. I'm not quite sure if that exactly answers your question, but I think that there is a lot of awareness and interest, and I see that as very positive.
Yeah, just to add to that, one of the questions that we asked you in terms of the topics we might explore in the future is really also, how do you design a responsible organization? So in this instance, Don is asking, what happens once you become aware of the bias? And then kind of how do you operationalize some of these values and principles that you might have already set up? Or if you don't have them, how do you use that opportunity to actually set up the values and principles? But most importantly, how do you actually enforce and react to those issues that are coming up? So it is a topic that we could explore in the future, in future webinars. So some really great questions coming through, and I'll also note that some of the questions are actually related to the topics that Amy and Amit will be covering in the next couple of webinars, as it's related specifically to the topic of bias. So we'll get to a couple of more questions in the remaining time that we have. There was a note that Facebook just established an oversight committee. That's correct. So we're following that. One question regarding actually culture practices. And I'll just ask Plan Team if they want to comment on this. What internal culture practices support reflexive thinking in this way? Do you believe culture matters in this? Either Nora or Haya, if you want to comment on this.
Yeah, I think so, especially for our youth, based on our experience and review on the conversations with young people. Like for young women who are based or grew up in rural areas and how they were raised by their families or parents, normally they are not so confident to apply for a more high paying jobs. And yeah, so I would say yes, that the culture there yeah, significantly affect on how this data will be. I guess that's for the user perspective of entering their information, right, or data. But in terms of the developers or the designers who build the product, that's also makes sense, because in some way it, and maybe unconsciously again, that based on their personal um, opinion or interest or culture, that can also be embedded on the algorithm that they're building.
Thank you, Haya. Nora, anything else you'd like to add on this?
No, absolutely. I think organizational culture matters, and ensuring that the entire organization is able to live the principles of that organization, and be they feminist principles, or making sure that, you know, you're putting the rights and safety of children at the center, and having all parts of the organization live that in their work, as opposed to only those specifically working on those issues. I think it is hugely important, and will be reflected then in how you use technology more broadly as well, including AI.
Yeah, thank you. I do want to acknowledge a couple of questions that have come in, really fantastic questions about data and bias that we'll tackle in the next couple of webinars. But I also want to mention that there are a number of ways bias can enter AI systems. It could be bias in the model itself, sampling bias in the data collection, labeling, proxies. Will just seeing this interest also is a good indicator that what we have planned for the next 2 webinars will help actually address some of these questions. And actually, Seth, I hope you can answer the question about where to register for the next set of webinars. And let me see, we can just quickly take potentially just one last question. And it's a question about the diverse teams, something, Haya, that you talked about, and Nora, you referenced. So diverse development teams cannot solve 100% the fact that international NGOs work with a wide diversity of people and cultural frameworks. So based on your experience, what strategy would you recommend for global solutions to be applied in such diverse contexts? Just a couple of brief thoughts, as we have about a minute left.
So I'll just give one brief thought, and that's awareness. Yes, we can't always have everyone represented in every team, but we can be aware of the need to seek out diverse opinions and voices as we develop, and not think that we know best.
Great. Haya, anything else that you'd like to comment on this?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm going with Nora, because yeah, I agree. It's totally, having the development diversified is just one thing, but it's just, just 0.001%. But the rest is really more of the organization to build that awareness, so that to be embedded in their policies and their frameworks. So yeah.
Yeah, and one thing that I'll note here is, because what I've seen, nearly 90% of the AI solutions in the sector are actually developed in partnership with the technology experts from outside of the sector. So whether it's academic institutions or private sector technology companies, it's important, as you develop these principles and values and frameworks, to ensure that that really applies to the people and organizations that you're partnering with, whether you're partnering with a developer or with an implementer. So the whole ecosystem that's involved in designing and supporting the use of the solution needs to have shared values and approach that you'd like to see. With that, thank you, first of all, to Nora and Haya for joining me today, and to our collaborators from USAID and MIT for helping plan this. Hopefully this has given you some ideas around what we'll be covering over the next few weeks, but also an opportunity to share your ideas with us in terms of what topics you'd like to discuss, or if you have any specific examples that you'd like to share. And hopefully this also was valuable to you and answered some of the questions that you had. Thank you so much for joining us, and see you on June 4th.
Thank you again for attending today's session. Please take a moment to complete our webinar satisfaction survey. There's a link to that survey in the chat window. And don't forget, you'll receive a follow-up email with a link to the webinar recording and other collateral that will be loaded up onto the webinar landing page on the NetHope Solutions Center. I'm Madeline No with NetHope, and please have a great rest of your day.